I've met a lot of people over the years who have money, I mean real money, more than they'll ever need. And a surprising number of them don't feel safe. They don't feel secure. They lie awake at night worrying about the market, worrying about their job, worrying about whether they have enough. And I find that interesting because if having money doesn't make you feel safe, then what does? I've thought about this question a lot because I see it everywhere. People making $50,000 a year worried about money. People making $500,000 a year worried about money. People with $1 million in the bank worried about money. It doesn't seem to matter how much you have. The anxiety is there, the feeling that it could all fall apart, that it's not quite enough, that you're not quite safe. And I think that's worth examining because if we don't understand why we feel this way, we're never going to fix it. Let me start with something I've observed. Most people never actually define what financial safety means to them. They just know they want it. They know they don't have it. But if you ask them, what would it take for you to feel safe? What's the number? What's the situation? They couldn't tell you. Not really. It's vague. It's somewhere out there in the future when I make more, when I save more, when things settle down. But it never comes because they're chasing something they haven't defined. I think about this with young people especially. Someone in their 20s or 30s. They're working hard, making decent money, starting to save. And they feel anxious. They feel behind, like they should be further along. But further along to where? What's the destination? They don't know. They're just running. And that feeling of not being safe, it's really a feeling of not knowing where you're going or whether you're on track because there is no track, not one they've defined anyway. Now, part of this is the world we live in. Everything feels uncertain, the economy, the job market, the future. There's a constant stream of news telling you to be worried, telling you something bad might happen, and maybe it will. Things do happen. But this constant state of alertness, this constant anxiety, it's not actually making you safer. It's just making you miserable. And I've seen people with plenty of money who live this way, consumed by worry, always preparing for disaster, never able to relax and enjoy what they have. Here's something else I've noticed. The feeling of safety isn't really about the amount of money. It's about the gap between what you spend and what you have. If you spend everything you make, you don't feel safe, even if you make a lot, because you know you're vulnerable. You know that if something goes wrong, you're in trouble. But if you spend half of what you make, if you've got savings, if you've got room to breathe, you feel different, even if the actual dollar amount is smaller. I've lived this way for a long time. I've always spent much less than I make, much less. And that creates a buffer, a margin of safety. And that margin, that's what gives you peace, not the income itself, the margin. But most people don't have a margin. They spend right up to what they make, sometimes more. And then they wonder why they feel anxious. Well, of course you feel anxious. You're one problem away from a crisis. That's not a comfortable place to be. Let me tell you about something I call lifestyle creep. It's one of the main reasons people never feel safe. You start out living simply because you have to. You don't make much money, so you live in a small place. You drive an old car. You don't spend much, and then your income goes up. And instead of maintaining that lifestyle and banking the difference, you upgrade. Better apartment, better car, more stuff. And it feels good at first, but now your expenses are higher. And pretty soon you need that higher income just to maintain your life. You're not more secure than you were before. You're just living at a higher level of expense. And this happens at every income level. I've seen it. Someone making 40,000 lives modestly and feels okay. Then they make 80,000 and they upgrade everything. Now they need 80,000 just to maintain their lifestyle. They're not safer. They're just spending more. And if anything, they're less safe because they've gotten used to a standard of living that requires that income. If something happens, if they lose their job or take a pay cut, they can't easily go back. They're locked in. And that creates anxiety. The people who feel safest, in my experience, they're not the ones making the most money. They're the ones who live below their means, significantly below. They know they could cut back if they had to. They know they have options. They're not trapped by their lifestyle. And that flexibility, that freedom, that's what safety really is. It's not a dollar amount. It's flexibility. It's knowing you'll be okay even if things change. But that requires discipline. It requires you to resist the urge to inflate your lifestyle every time your income goes up. And that's hard because society tells you to do the opposite. It tells you to enjoy your success, to reward yourself, to get the nicer things. And if you do that, if you follow that advice, you'll never feel safe because you'll always be spending what you make, always be dependent on that next paycheck, always be vulnerable. I think about fear too. Fear plays a huge role in why people don't feel safe. And it's interesting because sometimes the fear doesn't make logical sense. I've known people with several $1,000,000 saved, no debt, good income, and they're still afraid they'll run out, afraid of losing it, afraid of making a mistake. The money didn't eliminate the fear. In some cases, it made it worse because now they have something to lose. This is a psychological thing more than a financial thing. People just carry anxiety about money no matter what. It's in their nature. Maybe they grew up poor. Maybe they saw their parents struggle. Maybe they just have a cautious temperament. And for these people, no amount of money will make them feel truly safe because the problem isn't the money. It's the mindset. It's the emotional relationship with money and security. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have answers for that kind of deep-rooted anxiety, but I do think it's worth recognizing. Because if your financial anxiety is really about something else, about past trauma or about personality, then trying to solve it by making more money won't work. You need to address the real issue. And that might mean talking to someone, getting help, understanding where this fear comes from. For most people, though, I think the issue is simpler. They don't feel safe because they're not safe. Not really. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have savings. They're in debt. They haven't built any real cushion. And somewhere in the back of their mind, they know this. They know they're vulnerable. So the anxiety makes sense. It's a signal that's telling them something's wrong. And instead of listening to that signal and changing their behavior, they just try to ignore it. Or they try to make more money, which, as I said earlier, doesn't fix the underlying problem. Let me talk about social comparison for a minute. This is a big one. People look around at what others have, what their ends are doing, what their neighbors are buying, and they feel like they need to keep up. They need to have similar things, live a similar lifestyle. And this creates enormous pressure because you're always comparing, always measuring, and there's always someone doing better, always someone with more. So you never feel like you have enough. You never feel safe because safety in your mind is tied to having what others have, maybe a little more. But that's a target that keeps moving. It's impossible to hit. I've never cared about any of that. What someone else has or does, that's their business. It has nothing to do with me. And I think that's freed me from a lot of anxiety that other people carry because I'm not competing. I'm not comparing. I'm just living my life, making decisions based on what makes sense for me, not what someone else might think. And that's a much more peaceful way to live. But it takes confidence to do that. It takes being comfortable going your own way. And not everyone is. Most people want to fit in, want to be seen as successful, want validation from others. And if that's important to you, you're going to spend money to get it. And that spending, that need for external validation, it's going to prevent you from ever feeling truly safe because you're always performing, always trying to prove something. And that's exhausting and expensive. Here's another thing. People confuse income with wealth, with security. They think, if I just make this much P our year, then I'll be safe. But income is just one piece. What matters is what you do with it. Someone making $100,000 a year who saves $30,000 is in much better shape than someone making $300,000 who saves nothing. But we don't think about it that way. We just see the big income and assume that person has it figured out. They might not. They might be stressed and anxious and struggling. They're just doing it at a higher price point. I've always focused on building wealth, not income. Now, income is important. You need money coming in. But what you keep, what you invest, what compounds over time, that's what creates real security. That's what creates the feeling of safety because you've got assets. You've got resources that aren't dependent on you showing up to work every day. And that changes everything. That's when you start to relax a little, when you realize you could stop working and be okay, or at least you could take a break. You're not trapped. Most people never get there because they spend everything. They don't build wealth. They just have income, and income can disappear. You lose your job, you get sick, something happens. And if all you have is income, you're vulnerable. But if you've built wealth, if you've saved and invested over the years, you've got a foundation, something solid underneath you. And that's what safety actually is. Let me tell you something about responsibility too. This is interesting. People often feel less safe as they take on more responsibility. You get married, you have kids, you buy a house, and each of these things is good. They're what make life meaningful, but they also increase your financial obligations. Now, you're not just taking care of yourself, you're taking care of others. You've got a mortgage, you've got mouths to feed, and the weight of that, it can create anxiety, even if your income has gone up to match the new expenses. I see this with young families, especially both parents working, making decent money combined, but they're stretched thin. Childcare is expensive, the house is expensive, everything is expensive, and they feel like they're barely keeping their head above water. Not because they're doing anything wrong necessarily, just because life is expensive when you have responsibilities. And that feeling of being stretched, of not having much margin, it prevents you from feeling safe, even though on paper you might be doing okay. This is why the margin of safety is so important. You need room for things to go wrong, room for unexpected expenses, room for life to happen. If you're running at 100% capacity financially, you're going to feel anxious because you know there's no cushion, no backup. And life always throws something at you, always. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. I've structured my whole life around having a margin of safety in my investments, in my personal finances, in everything. I never want to be in a position where one problem creates a crisis. And that philosophy, that approach, it's given me peace, real peace. Not because I have a lot of money, but because I know I'm not vulnerable. I know I can handle whatever comes. And that knowledge, that confidence, that's worth more than any amount of money. But you can't buy it. You can't get there just by earning more. You get there by living below your means, by saving, by building a cushion, by being patient and disciplined over time. And most people aren't willing to do that. They want safety, but they're not willing to make the choices that create it. They want to feel secure while spending everything they make. And that's not how it works. It's never been how it works. I think there's also this idea that financial safety means you never have to worry again, that you reach some point where you've got so much money that nothing can touch you. And I understand the appeal of that idea, but it's not realistic. Even people with enormous wealth worry. They worry about losing it. They worry about making mistakes. They worry about their kids, about the economy, about all sorts of things. Money doesn't eliminate worry. It just changes what you worry about. So if we're being honest, complete financial safety doesn't exist. Not in the way most people imagine it. There's always uncertainty. There's always risk. Even if you do everything right, something could go wrong. The market could crash. You could get sick. The world could change in ways you didn't expect. And you have to accept that. You have to be comfortable with some level of uncertainty. Because if you're waiting to feel completely safe before you relax, you're going to be waiting forever. What you can do, though, what's within your control is build a life that's resilient, that can withstand shocks. And you do that by living below your means, by saving, by not taking on unnecessary debt, by keeping your lifestyle simple enough that you're not trapped, by having some resources set aside, by being smart about risk. These things don't guarantee safety, nothing does, but they give you the best chance. And more importantly, they give you peace because you know you've done what you can. You've been responsible. You've prepared as well as anyone can prepare. I think people also underestimate how much of this is about mindset, about how you think about money and security. I've been comfortable with uncertainty my whole life. I've made big bets. I've taken risks, but I've always done it in a calculated way, with a margin of safety. And I've been at peace with the idea that I can't control everything, that I might be wrong sometimes. And that acceptance, that comfort with uncertainty, it's allowed me to avoid the constant anxiety that a lot of people live with. But if you can't accept uncertainty, if you need guarantees, you're going to struggle because there are no guarantees, not in investing, not in business, not in life. You do your best. You make good decisions. And then you live with the outcomes and you adjust as you go. That's all anyone can do. And the sooner you make peace with that, the better you'll feel, even if your bank account doesn't change. Here's what I want you to understand. Financial safety is mostly a feeling. Yes, it's based on reality, on actual numbers, on whether you've saved and prepared. But it's also subjective. It's about what you need to feel okay, and that's different for everyone. Some people feel safe with 10,000 in the bank. Others don't feel safe with 1 million. So the question you need to ask yourself is, what would it actually take for me to feel safe? What do I need? Not what does someone else need? What do I need? And then, are my current choices moving me toward that or away from it? Because if you're spending everything you make, you're moving away from safety every single month. And no amount of income is going to change that. But if you're saving, if you're building a cushion, if you're living below your means, then you're moving toward it slowly, steadily, and eventually you'll get there. You'll reach a point where you can breathe, where the anxiety eases, where you feel like you're going to be okay. That's what most people are really looking for. Not to be rich, just to feel like they're going to be okay, to be able to sleep at night, to not be constantly stressed about money. And you can have that. Most people can, but not by chasing more income, not by trying to keep up with others, not by spending more. You get it by doing the opposite, by pulling back, by simplifying, by focusing on what actually matters and letting go of the rest. I know that's not what you want to hear. It's not exciting. It's not sexy. It doesn't promise quick results or dramatic changes, but it's the truth. It's what I've seen work over decades of watching people succeed and fail with money. The ones who feel safe, who sleep well at night, they're the ones who figured this out, who built their lives on a solid foundation instead of a house of cards. And the ones who never feel safe, who are always anxious no matter how much they have, they're the ones who keep spending, who keep inflating their lifestyle, who never build a margin, who are always dependent on the next paycheck. And they stay on that treadmill until they can't anymore. And that's a hard way to live. It really is. So I'd encourage you to think about this, to really think about it. What does financial safety mean to you? Not in some vague someday kind of way. Specifically, what would it take? And then what are you doing today that's either moving you toward that or away from it? Because that's all that matters. The daily choices, the patterns, the discipline or lack of it, that's what determines whether you ever feel safe. Most people never do. And it's not because they don't have enough money. It's because they never figured out what enough means. And they never built their life in a way that creates security. They just kept running, kept spending, kept worrying. And that's a tragedy because it doesn't have to be that way. It really doesn't.